Hi, I'm Ollie Wright, UP2070883. This is my submission for CT6PSYDR Design Portfolio Part 2, a redesign of Press Space, based on psychological concepts. Press Space is a branching narrative puzzle game that explores the relationship between players and developers of games. While the original design was well received, Chapter 1 was constantly criticised as kind of bloated and a little slow, so it was decided within this module Chapter 1 would be redesigned with psychological principles in mind. The implementation was mostly programmatic and audio based, since the game's original theming was about the crescendo of complexity throughout the game, originally just as visual, then audio, then graphical, and so forth. However, as soon as players reached the point where the narrator was introduced, they tended to fare a lot better in understanding what to do. Therefore, I moved out to the very beginning of the game, rather than halfway through the first chapter. This then meant that the crescendo was audio, then visual, and then graphical, before becoming 3D in later segments. The other changes will be mentioned in the latter portion of this video. Here is some gameplay, but it also has a key visualizer in the bottom left so you know what I'm pressing on the keyboard. Unfortunately, I can't show full gameplay throughout this video, as it mostly uses narration, which is also my voice. Hello, welcome to this interactive demonstration for the game Press Space. Your keyboard is temporarily disabled for the duration of these instructions. Please listen carefully to these stipulations before playing the game. Rule 1. Press space. Rule 2. Do not press any key other than space. Please continue pressing space. Unfortunately, your repeated disobedience of the game's rules have become unproductive for the purposes of this playtest. After conducting research on player psychology, negative audio-visual stimuli have been introduced. This should discourage inappropriate behavior. Please do not press any key other than space. Right. Okay, look, I'm gonna level with you here. This is incredibly frustrating, and I've spent years developing my magnum opus, and your repeated disobedience is unwarranted and unfair. During playtesting, namely at the grad show, I noticed a number of players would sit around not really doing much and waiting for something to happen. This was because they'd not been explicitly guided by the game as to what to do. This showed that the original design had a lack of intrinsic motivators for players, instead relying on the extrinsic motivation of being told what to do by the game, which at that point didn't exist and caused a number of issues where I'd have to point people in the correct direction. This was tackled in the opening by guiding players using reverse psychology that they maybe don't just have to press space like the game's name would imply. By simply mentioning in the narration that other keys may have a response when pressed, playtesters consistently were able to find their way through the earlier levels much faster. Also, I greatly reduced the number of key presses necessary to progress, especially in the earlier stages where they aren't given direct feedback for pressing either the correct or incorrect buttons. This tightening of the ideas and speed up of feedback took the first chapter from approximately 4 minutes to about 2. When playtesting, there were far fewer reports of any bloat or slowness during the chapter. The conditioning was in the original game, but was poorly signposted to players. At the time, deliberately so. It was meant to be a kind of pretentious game anyway, which didn't really have many affordances made for players who were new to the genre. Despite this, it still massively alienated those, even with proficiency in games. By having a tongue-in-cheek pointing to the idea of conditioning, it actually enables me to do it better, and players responded well to the ideas that the game was almost rewarding them for not pressing space. In this case, the extrinsic motivator was the game adding content because you were disobeying it. The inclusion of conditioning is the motivation to move forward, since the conditioning methods themselves are generally pretty crude as they are in-universe added by the narrator, a character that's generally pretty incompetent. The ideas of cognitive psychology inform the ability to skip the first chapter almost entirely by just interrupting the narrator a number of times. At face value, it does seem simple that just pressing a button 5 times can essentially skip the first chapter. However, the way it's hidden relies on a subversion of transludic knowledge, which is knowledge developed from other games, of concepts such as the rule of 3, but also how games will generally allow you to skip sections. I took inspiration from games such as Outer Wilds, which employ knowledge-based exploration. That is, where the player is always technically capable of doing something, but they require exploration in order to reach the point where they understand that they could the whole time. This works by subverting a rule of 3, where the first 3 times you interrupt the narrator, you get different voice lines, and then on the 4th, it repeats the one it just did. In playtests, this resulted in players not attempting to do it another time because they assumed they'd reached the end of the extra content. However, completing it just one more time enables them to skip the whole first chapter, but they didn't tend to find this until the 4th or 5th time playing the game, which then sped up their subsequent playthroughs. Hello. Well, that key is incorrect. Please listen to Please do not interrupt. In fact, rule 3. Yep, brilliant. Okay, awesome. Great. Yep, please. Yep, brilliant. Okay, awesome. Great. Yep, please stop. You know what? Forget this. We can do something else. Right, I put this together as fast as I could. Pressing space will now make you jump. In addition, I added 2 new endings to the game. The release ending is a very short ending that occurs directly at the start of the game if you obey the narrator. It's black text on a white background and basically directs you straight back to the start. This is deliberately short so that the players understand that there is more content if they go elsewhere. Ideally, they combine this with the rules read out to them and realize that by pressing other keys they can access more content. Similarly, the review ending gets triggered when players finally listen to the narrator midway through the conditioning section in the middle of the chapter. This is more of a jokey ending, and it aims to reinforce the ideas that the playtest you're partaking in is completely fictional before kicking you back to the start of the game. The design did run into limitations, especially when it came to playtesting. For my changes according to cognitive psychology, I was only able to find playtesters with experience in games. Therefore, I might be able to assume that they're applying their transludic knowledge naturally to their time in press space. Although I think it would have been good to test on players who hadn't had experience in this kind of genre before and didn't understand games. I would have liked to have seen if the rule of 3 expectations carried over from other pieces of media, or if players immediately found the skip. Additionally, the visual design is lacking. This is intentional, but I feel like it could detract from the experience, especially for a player that doesn't quite understand that the audio affordances are so important in the game. Future iterations might add more elements of visuality in the later part of this section, in a similar way to the way audio was introduced in the original version. Lastly, outside of some informal questioning, the feedback I got on the player motivation was relatively colloquial. It'd be nice to have a more diverse group of playtesters who can more accurately and anonymously give me ideas of how my changes affected their experience. Overall, the redesign was very effective in reaching my goals of cutting the bloat from Chapter 1. In addition, I leveraged behavioural psychology to keep players motivated and moving forward through the level, and leveraged cognitive psychology to let players skip the first part of the game, but only when they've subverted expectations and gained experiential knowledge through playing. Thank you for watching.